good evening, and welcome to Hardwired, Human Consciousness and Christian Belief. I'm Sarah Wilson. I'm the Program Director for ISCAST, and before we begin, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we meet, and to also recognise those countless injustices that have been suffered by Indigenous peoples across the world and throughout history today. Our Heavenly Father entrusted the estate from where I'm speaking from tonight to the stewardship of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to Indigenous elders past and present. I just thought I'd also mention that we're planning a second series of conversations, which will start in mid-September, and we'll let you know a little bit more about that event and the theme of those new conversations very soon. But before I introduce our speaker tonight, I invite you to pray with me. Creator God, as we meet together and work our way through this series on human consciousness, please help us to better understand the mystery and wonder of this extraordinary gift. We ask that when thinking through this deep and complicated topic, that our faith in you and your resurrected Son be stronger, more resolute, especially as we are challenged with new ideas and ways to think. We thank you for Peggy, for her many gifts and her willingness to share her wisdom with us. Please be with her as she speaks to us tonight, and help us learn from her experiences and be gracious with one another as we further our conversation on this great mystery. Please bless our time together. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Tonight we have the pleasure of hearing from Peggy Kern, who is a researcher at the University of Melbourne. She's also an associate professor in Wellbeing science. Her research examines who thrives in life and why, including understanding and measuring healthy functioning, identifying individual and social factors impacting life trajectories, and systems-informed approaches to wellbeing. Tonight, Peggy will be talking on what is wellbeing, personality and social influences on conceptualizations of wellbeing. And I invite Peggy now. Welcome.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and really look forward to sharing with you tonight. My area is this area of positive psychology, which focuses on promoting well-being in individuals and communities. And my research specifically focuses on personality and social influences on well-being. And what I'd like to talk to you tonight about is influences on conceptualizations of well-being. I come from the social sciences, perhaps a different area than many of you, but I think something that is really important. When we think about well-being, there's different ways of conceptualizing and understanding what well-being is. Firstly, an important distinction to make is the distinction between objective versus subjective well-being. And so from an objective perspective, we can say that well-being is sort of the conditions that create a sense of well-being for individuals. And so things like our, healthcare, our family life, are the different things that actually make well-being actually possible, which is going to differ considerably among individuals. And combined with this is subjective perspectives about well-being, which includes things such as your sense of the life well lived, things that actually give pleasure to your life, and things that actually make things more challenging in life. And so for this presentation, I'm going to focus on subjective perspectives about well-being. And subjective perspectives include several different aspects. This includes feeling good and functioning well across multiple dimensions of life, such as your physical health, your mental well-being, your financial well-being, and spiritual well-being. And so how you feel in different areas of your life. And the literature has really made a distinction in the subjective perspective between what's called hedonic well-being, which relates to your feeling of happiness. And so existence of positive well-being versus feelings of negative. So things like feeling depressed, feeling very anxious, feeling a sense of anger. And so these are the more hedonic sides of well-being. Eudaimonic well-being is very much about a sense of having a sense of meaning in life, the life well lived, that deeper sense of I am a functioning person and really living well in the life that I have, whatever that actually looks like. And there's multiple models and frameworks that exist that really try to map out what well-being looks like for individuals. An example of this is Marty Seligman created the Perma Model, which includes multiple elements of well-being. And he suggests that well-being includes 5 dimensions, which are captured by the acronym of PERMA. So this includes positive emotions, feeling positively about your life, having a sense of engagement, and so I'm involved in life, having positive relationships with others, which we see across the literature are really important for a sense of well-being. So how we relate to others, having a sense of connection with others actually really has a big impact upon our sense of well-being. A sense of meaning. So why does life matter? And really seeing that from an individual perspective, and a sense of accomplishment. And so doing things in life. And if we take this model, we can actually create different ways to promote well-being. And so, for instance, to promote positivity, we can do things that actually promote our sense of well-being. Things like keeping a gratitude list, and each day taking a few moments to understand what are some good things that are actually happening in our life, as opposed to all the negatives that are constantly pushing down on us. Savoring the good, cultivating gratitude, practicing kindness, and reducing the stressors that are in our lives. So stress is a big thing that creates negative emotion. And so the more that we can be reducing those feelings of stress, we could actually be promoting that positivity that we experience. With engagement, what are ways that we can actually be identifying what are the things that we're actually good at? Those are our strengths. How can we actually be using our strengths to engage in everyday life? And so we can go through each of the pieces of well-being according to the Perma Model to actually be promoting well-being in ourselves and in others. But an important question that comes up is, can we actually assume that a one-size model fits all? And the Perma Model suggests that, if we do these things that promote our well-being, we can actually experience well-being. But what we see in the studies that we've done is that well-being is very individual in nature, and what works well for some people will not work well for other people. George Valiant, who is a predominant researcher in the well-being space, he did a study that looked at a lifespan study of individuals across their entire lives. And what he suggests is that no single interview, no single questionnaire is ever adequate to reveal the complete man. It's the mosaic of interviews produced that can be most revealing. What this speaks to is that well-being really differs across individuals. And one size model, like we'd like to say, like if you do this, you'll experience well-being. But what we see in the literature is that it actually depends a lot on who you are as an individual. And we can only understand that by digging deeper into how people experience a sense of well-being. And so that's what I've done through my studies. We've actually looked at what well-being looks like from different perspectives. And we looked at those with a highly sensitive personality, regular Ashtanga yoga practitioners, Chinese international students, secondary school math students, and Christianity perspectives. And so we're actually saying that well-being is not a fits all model. We actually need to understand well-being from people's perspectives, and that through that, we can actually better understand ways to promote well-being. What I would suggest is that we can learn a lot from the literature and the studies that we do, but there's something more that Christianity offers, which I'll turn to in the latter part of this talk. And so as part of this, we started to look at what well-being looks like from different perspectives, because we can only promote well-being if we actually understand what well-being actually looks like for individuals. And while there are models that suggest that well-being looks like this or that, it's only through understanding people's experiences of well-being that we can actually promote it. A first study that we did looked at people with highly sensitive personalities. And so this is a personality trait where people are much more prone to seeing things in a different light. They're very sensitive in nature, and a highly sensitive personality does align with those suffering from autism, as well as other sensitivity related traits. And what we see there is that well-being actually entails several components, including a sense of balance. And so it's not just experiencing positive emotions all the time. It was actually much more about balancing positive and negative emotions, balancing life demands, balancing a sense of I need to be everything to everyone. There was actually much more of a sense of I need to be what I am to myself. There was a sense of we need to look at different dimensions of well-being. So it's not just feeling good and functioning well. There's actually multiple dimensions that we need to look at in order to support well-being. One thing that came out a lot was a sense of spiritual well-being, that there's a spiritual side to a sense of well-being, which is not captured through a lot of the well-being models that we see in the literature. The participants identified different enablers of well-being, including connecting with nature, emotional self-regulation, daily well-being practices, and others as listed here in the table here. Several of the barriers to well-being included saying no to others. And so those with a highly sensitive personality often felt a lot of pressure to give in to others, but they actually felt a sense of well-being when they actually said no to others. And that's hard to do, but it was something that they found was really promoting of a sense of well-being. Having experiences of depression, anxiety, and trauma undermined a sense of well-being. And it was actually very helpful for people to understand I have a personality trait that is sensitive in nature, and that if I respect that, I actually experience well-being. And if I don't respect that, then it actually undermines my sense of well-being. In a second study, we looked at well-being in regular Ashtanga yoga practitioners. This is a diagram that represents words that came up when people considered their sense of well-being. There was several things that came up, such as the physical sense of well-being, your body and how that contributes to a sense of well-being, your mind. And so there was a real sense of we need to understand not just the psychological side of things, but we need to understand the physical side of things and how the two interact with one another. Some of the key findings that came up from this was that well-being is comprised of different dimensions, including emotional, psychological, physical, spiritual, social, and ethical aspects of well-being. Dimensions of well-being are interconnected and make sense as a whole, and well-being has an ever-changing and evolving essence. So it's not something that we just experience, but it's ever-changing, it's ever-evolving, and it's a sense of who we are as a person. Across this, there were different dimensions that came about. And so from a physical well-being perspective, this included being free and able to manage physical suffering on up to conscious and actively inhabiting the body. So it starts from a sense of distancing yourself from pain and moving to conscious awareness of the body as a whole. And we can see this across other dimensions, such as emotional well-being begins with being able to experience positive affect in the absence of negative affect. So we're acknowledging positive emotions and getting rid of negative emotions. And that evolves to a state of having emotional meta awareness and overall sense of balance and well-being. So as we actually accept the elements of well-being, then it actually moves us to a state of balance and steadiness that goes beyond what we could have from felt presence of things. In another study, we looked at Chinese international students living in Australia. They experienced, they perceived well-being as happiness, positivity, physical health was a key thing. Also, financial security was actually a key theme that really came out. Within this, there was multiple themes that came up. So from a mental health perspective, being psychologically sound, mental health is important. From a physical perspective, there was a lack of physical illness that represented well-being. Security was a key theme that came up, which included having reasonable income, adequate shelter, having a stable living situation, and so having a place to live. And prosperity came up as another key domain there, which was really about being satisfied with life, having clear purpose, finding passion in work. And so within this, there's this real sense of financial and physical stability that's actually really critical to a sense of well-being. And for students that are living abroad, oftentimes these elements of well-being are actually overlooked, but it's actually really important for actually creating a sense of I am stable in my life and I have a way of actually being centered and moving forward. And if that's missing, then well-being is often undermined in ways that have a big impact upon the mental health and well-being of our students. One final perspective was we looked at students that were in their subjects. And so instead of looking at well-being as an overall concept, we looked at students within their specific classes. And so in this sense, we were looking at those within their math class. And what we see here is that relationships were actually really important for a sense of well-being in the classes. And oftentimes that was undermined by a focus on the tasks that were there. And so what students actually value in their classes was oftentimes not being met. And through this, it was actually undermining the sense of well-being. And so we shouldn't be thinking about what do students value? What is it that is actually beneficial to them? And how can we actually be meeting that? And that is something that is very much lacking in a lot of our classes. A lot of it is about academic achievement, but it's not actually addressing the needs that students have. And through that, that's actually undermining their sense of well-being. So what does it look like from a biblical perspective? What I did was I looked at different conceptualizations of well-being. What we actually see here is that the theological perspective aligns with what's called the eudaimonic perspective, which is really focused on meaning, relationships, sense of purpose, sort of deeper levels of well-being, as opposed to hedonic well-being, which is really focused on emotions and the felt experience of well-being. Oftentimes in Christianity, it's really equating things with hedonic perspectives of well-being, which is really focused on fleeting pleasure. But what we need to really focus on is these deeper senses of well-being. As part of that, we're really looking at joy coming from centering one's lives on one's God, like the perspective of the purpose of God. And so it's really thinking about coming to know, love, and enjoy God better, which blesses both others and oneself. And so this is really thinking about those deeper levels of well-being that arise from giving oneself to God's purpose for one's life. And I think what we see in a lot of the perspectives of well-being that have come across in the different studies that I've done is that there's a real searching for that deeper sense of well-being that goes beyond hedonic or emotional perspectives about well-being. And it's really focusing on that deeper level of well-being, which oftentimes are lacking, but is something that people are searching for. I believe that Christianity actually gives that deeper level of meaning that is often what is lacking, but people are searching for. Looking at what people coming from a Christian perspective identify as a sense of well-being. So what I did is I had people identify what are top concepts that represent well-being, and some of the big things that come out here. So the bigger words are representing a stronger sense of well-being, and we see things such as love, grace, love for others, forgiveness. And there's this real sense of giving to others that comes out with this. One thing that's really important that comes out in the biblical perspective is the importance of telos. A lot of the theories about flourishing and happiness in the positive psychology literature are very self-driven, and there's a reason for what we actually do. A lot of the well-being theories focus on elements of flourishing, such as positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. But there is a lack of a purpose or an outcome. And so it's sort of like the purpose of things within the positive psych literature is about fulfillment and enjoyment. But what that means is really defined by the individual. Christianity calls for a higher purpose defined by God, and this is an understanding of one's own purpose as living for God, and then through that we actually impact upon others. And so there's a real sense of there's a reason behind the things that we actually do. There's a purpose to life in general, and within that, well-being comes from that. Within positive psychology, there's a misconception that we just dismiss suffering, but there's a huge part of this that negative aspects of life actually give a sense of, we have a stronger sense of why things actually matter. So through the negative, we actually experience positive outcomes. And so it's actually about recognizing and embracing the importance of negative emotions and negative experiences, aiming for psychology that embraces the full spectrum of human functioning. So that negative emotions are actually there, but actually through that, there's a fuller sense of life and a sense of purpose. As a whole, the Christian perspective provides three things for the ideas of flourishing. First of all, there's a purpose behind feeling good and functioning well. Christianity calls for a higher purpose, which is found in God alone. Secondly, flourishing is separate from pleasure and is separable from the good and virtuous life. And so flourishing is not just feeling good all the time. There's actually a deeper sense of the full life experience, which includes elements of suffering, but through that, we actually experience God in deeper ways. Thirdly, flourishing and suffering can coexist. is through struggle that growth occurs. And so from this perspective, flourishing is best viewed in terms of one's life journey, growth as a whole person, rather than a snapshot of a person at any point in time. So the key takeaways from this, first of all, personality and social factors influence people's perceptions of and pathways towards well-being. We really see this across the literature, is that who we are as people and the experiences that we have actually influence upon our sense of well-being. Christianity aligns with eudaimonistic conceptualizations of well-being, which suggests that well-being is not just about our felt experience of happiness, but it's actually about deeper levels of the life well lived, which is challenging. It has a lot of negative experiences within that, but through it, we actually experience a broader purpose and function of our lives. It adds a purpose, which is grounded in relationship with God. And so this is something that Christianity adds to the post-psych literature, which is often overlooked and missed, is that a lot of the post-psych literature is really focused on the felt experience of well-being with no purpose behind it. But what we see through Christianity is that it gives a life and purpose to the experiences that we actually have, for better or for worse. And that everything has a sense of meaning through its grounding in our relationship with God, which is often missing in the post-psych literature, but is something that Christianity really adds to the existing literature that is actually there. And finally, idiographic approaches can be scaled across common characteristics are needed to adequately and successfully address mental health and well-being challenges. And so we need to be thinking about the individual experience of well-being. And it's not just about a one-size-fits-all model, but it's actually that we need to be thinking about people's experiences as a whole. The practical implications of this is that if we want to positively impact upon well-being, it starts with understanding what it means to the individual. What I've seen across my studies is that well-being looks different for different people. And if we actually want to positively impact upon lives, we actually need to understand what well-being looks like for the individual. And it's only through that way that we can actually impact upon them. Secondly, a sense of meaning and relationship with other people are essential to experiences of well-being. If we look at models of well-being, Christianity provides a purpose for the things that we do. That is, we do things for the purpose of our God-given intention on life. And Christianity also provides community. So oftentimes we're connecting with others, we're creating life with others. And so Christianity provides that. Finally, it's critical to prioritize personal and collective well-being. When we are well, whatever that looks like for us as individuals, we are best suited to positively impact upon others. And so we really need to be thinking about what is right for me as an individual, and how can I use that to actually flow out to others in positive ways. Within that, we can positively impact on ourselves. And then once we do that, we can positively impact upon others. So this is a bit about thinking about intersections of well-being and Christianity. And so I'll end it there and happy to answer questions that you might have.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Peggy, for sharing your research with us and pointing to lots of things that raise lots of questions in my mind. And I'm not sure quite where to start, so I'm hoping somebody else will have a question, and they do have some questions. Richard, would you like to unmute yourself and speak to us?
A couple of things. One was the connection between well-being and flourishing, a term that's being used a lot by Seligman and others. But the other question I put in the chat is, you may have said it and I might have missed it. Have you looked across other religious traditions and how well-being is defined and understood? Buddhism, for example, has a lot to say about suffering. And Buddhist monks showed their purpose during the Vietnam War. So there's purpose there as well as suffering and community. Just wondered if you looked into that at all.
It's a great question. I have not looked across different religious traditions. So that would be a really good place for further research.
A lifetime of research for you there.
Yep.
Thanks, Richard. Doru has a question.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you, Peggy. Very illuminating. I'll just read my question there. I struggled a bit to formulate my thoughts. So it has been interesting to see how all those case studies actually ignore the classical ancient concepts, Christian and otherwise, that connects ethical behavior and well-being, or the fact that the cultivation of virtue conditions our well-being. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about this. What would be the cause of this kind of shift from the classical idea of well-being conditioned by virtue to this quest for flourishing without any thought of personal transformation by way of, let's say, exercising oneself? That's the idea of virtue in antiquity, exercising oneself in view of higher purposes, perhaps in our case, divinely revealed purposes.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's fascinating in the literature, the pol-sci literature, is that there's a real disconnection from sort of ethical basis of things. So I think there's a lot there that could actually be pursued in the literature, but has been completely ignored. So it's sort of like people's perspectives of things, that underlying ethical standard of things has been completely ignored in the pol-sci literature. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for creating connections there. There is some work that has actually looked at combining ethical perspectives with the well-being literature. But that's not the common approach to things. And I think it's actually really lacking in terms of what the correct perspectives of well-being actually are.
Thanks, Peggy. I wonder if I could make just a comment now. You've painted a picture of the sort of the immediate happiness, hedonic sort of seeking pleasure in the moment, maybe, or forgive me for my loose phraseology, versus the eudaimonic, having a big picture of life, a purpose in life, and getting satisfaction out of that purpose. And just going back to Doru's question, maybe, and I'm postulating it for your comment, maybe having a big purpose in life, one way of doing that could be that it's governed by an ethical sort of a fairly clear ethical framework. Another way could be that it's not governed by an ethical framework, but irrespective, it still serves a big purpose in life. So I think imagine a mafia family who are happy to kill people, happy to run drugs, but at the same time they might have a sort of big picture purpose in life, which is about killing people, running drugs, becoming powerful, and that could that give them what you're calling eudaimonic well-being? There's the question.
That's a really great question. And clearly there are people that have had that huge sense of purpose and that huge sense of connection to others and whatnot in very detrimental ways if we think about their impact upon society. And I think the bias of the pol-sci perspective is focusing on optimal ways of functioning. And so
let me just count the positive psychology perspective. Is that what you referred to?
Yep.
You said pos-sci, I think, and some people mightn't have quite caught it. Yep, go ahead. What's the downside of the positive psychology perspective?
So I think the bias of the pol-sci perspective is focusing on things that move people to optimal functioning. So it's really focusing on things that actually promote society, promote individual well-being. And I think it's very easy to say, like, if you have a huge sense of meaning in, or a huge sense of, this is what I do that fulfills me, but actually is completely detrimental to others, I would not say that that's actually well-being. And that the bias of the pol-sci perspective is that it's in things that are promoting to individuals and to society. And it's not things that actually completely destroy others. And so there's a sense of protecting people from the negative sides of life.
So presumably that bias towards promoting, dare I say, the common good or something like that, that bias would be something that Christians would be glad to see as a bias in the positive psychology perspective.
I would say so. Yeah. So sort of like everything that we see as promoting our God-given purpose are things that would actually very much align with the positive perspective. So it's all about loving others, loving, a sense of purpose and whatnot. So I would say that very much aligns with the Christianity perspective of bringing out the best in others, loving God. So it's all the positive things of life that I would say is what Pol Psych really focuses on. What I would say is that the Pol Psych perspective in some ways is a pseudo-religion, which is parallels Christianity without having a sense of God driving all of this. And so a lot of the ethical and moral perspectives that you see in Christianity, I would say align with the Pol Psych perspective, but the difference is that Pol Psych does not have a sense of God and does not have a sense of it. So it aligns with the same morals of promoting goodness in life and promoting the best in people. But it lacks that sense of a God underlying all of like the purpose that we do things. And so it feels like it parallels things without that sense of purpose that we actually see in Christianity.
Thank you. Why don't we go to John Howell?
Thank you, Peggy, for your talk. In New Zealand, we have a well-being budget.
Yep.
And it got me thinking about what is meant by well-being. Often the notion of happiness and flourishing is connected with well-being. That's a term that came up in your word charts. But I've noticed that the Beatitudes are often translated happy is as opposed to blessed, or instead of blessed. And I'd like to suggest that in actual fact, you can think of well-being as being blessed in the religious sense. And if we're thinking about being blessed, it seems to me that the gospel offers more than just a purpose, it offers a path. Mm. And my thinking here is if you look at the kingdom of God, for example, which is about parables and often about the wise person versus the foolish person. And then there's the stream of healing stories, which we can interpret as stories in which you will be well. You are brought to wellness. And rather than having a formula, here you have a stream of literature which points to a path in which you can achieve well-being, happiness, and blessedness. Would you like to comment on the notion of path as well as purpose?
I think paths are actually completely spot on. I think a lot of the positive literature is actually focused on pathways to well-being. So I think, like I said, the Christianity gives a purpose. That's the telos. So there's a reason for why we do what we do. But there's also, if we look through scriptures, there's a lot of pathways to well-being. And so I would actually say that Christianity adds both the purpose and the pathways to well-being. And that's something that the Pol-Sec literature is really focused on. First of all, what well-being is and trying to really define that. But there's also a lot of work on the pathways to well-being, which align very much with the Christian perspective. So things, for instance, such as focusing on gratitude and focusing on things that actually give us a sense of well-being. There's a lot of pathways that are actually there that we're finding support in the literature, which are very much supported by Christian perspectives, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Johanni has a question.
Peggy, thank you very much for your talk on well-being. I wonder whether your research on well-being has got any connection, or how does it link to things like World Happiness Index, World Happiness reports and things like that, which seem to be much more wide scale than the individual well-being that you've been talking about.
Yeah, so I think with the large surveys and whatnot, it's focusing on averages across a lot of individuals, and a lot of that is focused on life satisfaction and a sense of overall well-being. And I think that's important for getting a sense of how people are tracking as a whole. But I think that there's a lot of benefit of actually, we have the overall picture, but what does that look like for the individual? And what that looks like for the individual is actually very different than, well, at times it's different, at times it's very much aligned. So some people align with the averages that we see at those broader levels. But within that, I think there's a lot of opportunities for actually looking at individuals' experiences of well-being and really trying to understand, what does well-being mean for you? And from that, how can we actually promote well-being? And so I think those broader pictures are important for getting a snapshot of how people are going as a whole. But in terms of actually intervening to impact upon people's experiences, we actually need to break that down more to say, well, what does well-being mean to you specifically? And then how can we actually use that to actually impact upon your sense of well-being?
I wonder whether you've done any research on those countries that do very well in the World Happiness Report. Now, I just happen to come from Finland, which is supposed to be the happiest country in the world. So I might be in a pretty good position to suggest that might be an interesting research topic.
I think that would be a fantastic research question. I have not compared the different countries, and but I think there's a lot of opportunity for that moving forward.
Go for it.
Thank you for that one. Charles.
Greetings and thanks, Peggy. Particularly appreciated what you said about the importance of purpose and the Christian dimension to that. And that got me thinking of Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes, because there he's appearing to lose his perception of well-being, and two things seem to come out. The fact that death ends everything and there's nothing, your life doesn't seem to matter beyond that. There's no purpose to it. And also the fact that being good or being loving does not always get rewarded in this life. And that's what upset Solomon's well-being. And of course, that's answered by, in the Old Testament, the day of the Lord, or in the New Testament, by Judgment Day, where God's judgment will make sure good is rewarded and evil is punished. Is that one of the connections that you've seen made, or yes or no?
Remind me of the question, sorry.
With the question of purpose,
Yep.
And I think that is that purpose beyond just our life here, like into eternity, and the fact that on Judgment Day, God will make sure that good is rewarded and evil is punished. And that does give a great sense of well-being, or contributes to our well-being from Christianity.
So what we see in the literature is that sense of connection to something beyond self adds a lot to a sense of well-being. And that when there's a lack of sense of my life matters beyond the here and now, that we actually see a sense of low well-being. And so I think what we see in the scriptures in terms, obviously Solomon struggled a lot with that sense of meaning and purpose, and that there's this sense of meaninglessness of life. And we see a very similar thing across the literature in terms of when there's a sense of what is the purpose of things that I actually do. We actually see a low sense of well-being. Whereas if people can actually find a sense of my life matters for different reasons, whether that oftentimes that's a connection to something beyond the self, and the lack of that actually relates to a low sense of well-being. But if I can connect to something that's beyond myself, and I would say that Christianity gives that purpose and reason that a lot of people are actually looking for, and that there's a reason to keep going on with things that adds to a sense of well-being.
I was wondering about the connection between individual well-being and collective well-being.
Yep.
And the question that comes to me is the collective well-being simply the sum of all its parts, like a number of people who experience well-being in their lives, or is it more than that? Does it have more power than the collection of individuals? And a corollary question, if you like, could one individual or a few live in the whole lump, to use the biblical metaphor?
I would suggest that the combination of individuals is more than the sum of the parts. So I think one of the challenges of the post-psych literature is it's been very individual based. So it's sort of like my well-being, but that can actually be at the expense of the collective. And so in my work, we've actually suggested that well-being actually is not well-being if you're actually doing it at the expense of the broader community, and that we actually need to be thinking about well-being only exists if it's actually supporting the collective. And that's a different perspective, because a lot of it is all about me and all about the individual, but you can do a lot for your own individual well-being, which does not actually promote the collective. And so what we suggest in our work is that it's actually well-being actually only exists if it's actually me as part of a community that I'm actually a part of. If we actually start to say individual being is actually being not just only about how I feel, but it's actually how I contribute to the collective, then we start to get to a point where that well-being is actually something that the sum is greater than just the parts, or the collective is actually something that is not just the sum of the individuals, but it's actually the interaction of the individuals as they actually go forth with life that actually makes the well-being of the collective to actually arise. And so what I would suggest is that we actually have to move beyond individual well-being to actually be thinking about collective well-being, which is different than the sum of the parts.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the way you defined it seemed to be individual, but I think of something like the healthy church model, for example, that's collective well-being, isn't it?
Correct.
I'm trying to think about the link between the two, getting my head around it slowly. Thank you.
It's like, I still don't have my head around it, but I really think that what I've focused on here is we need to understand what well-being looks like for the individual, but we actually need to be thinking about that as individual as part of a collective. So we understand that, but then we actually have to be thinking about it's not just the individual, it's actually about the individual as part of the system they are part of.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Over to you, Sarah, is it?
Yes, thank you, Chris, and thank you very much, Peggy. I am just going to ask Nicola now, who's going to finish the evening with a prayer.
And thank you, Peggy, on behalf of New Zealand Christians in Science as well. That was really interesting. So let us pray. Loving God, protect us and guide us and inspire us as we go out into this night. Thank you for this discussion and this growing community of seekers and explorers. We are mindful of your world that you have created and of our minds, which are a puzzle and a wonder to us. We thank you tonight for Peggy, who has enlightened us on well-being. And we ask your blessing on our night and on our week ahead. In the name of Christ, amen.